Dubai Western University, and this is my thesis paper for Departmental Honors for Geography, and it's the Spatialization of Identity in Dubai, UAE. So just a little bit of an introduction about it. Dubai is often seen as sprouting from the desert from nothing over the last decade, even though it does have a pretty long historical trajectory. That's key for understanding the current socio-spatialities and varying geographies of Dubai, largely in regards to the migrant population or foreign population in general. And then there are three main groups that I kind of focus on: Emirati citizens, wealthy expatriates, and migrants. And I use the term migrant just to distinguish the lower income, largely South Asian workers from the wealthier expatriates, largely Western. And then I focus on state and elite constructions of identity and how they form the impetus for much of the situation in Dubai today. And then the government is largely responsible for the current morphology of the city as well. And then the idea of neoliberalism impacts the physical geography in Dubai, as well as how the city's heterogenous residents produce identity and belonging. And this is all just to say that the government has a large role in pretty much every sphere of life in Dubai, from physical landscape to the economy, culture, and identity. And then two distinct areas exist in the city, New Dubai and Old Dubai. And then it's characterized by patterns of inclusion and exclusion, not just in regards to who can access these spaces easily, but in terms of who belongs to the state and can thus claim belonging in Dubai and who does not. So my thesis was just that the role of the state is the biggest factor impacting space and identity in Dubai. So just briefly go through a little bit of history that pertains to this. Dubai has had a heterogeneous population since early in its history, owing to its history as a free port center of trade, and it has implemented neoliberal policies since the early 20th century, primarily through the elimination of customs duty that really established it as a free port, and then brought a lot of merchants from Iran especially, and then also India. And then its heritage, historically involves mercantile cosmopolitanism. And then as the city developed, it developed into two distinct areas: Dubai, which is on the south part of the creek, right around here, and then Dera, which is the northern part of the creek. And then I don't think it's possible to have a discussion on Dubai without talking about infrastructure somewhat, because it's largely viewed as the key to the success of the city. It started in the 1950s and 60s with the dredging of the creek, which really made it an even more important port, thus bringing more foreign merchants and immigrants into the city. And oil revenue was used for many of these early projects, both oil revenue from Dubai that they got from their offshore deposits, which were very small, and then increased oil revenue from throughout the Gulf that was poured in to finance these infrastructure projects as well. But the two biggest things kind of for the focus of this project and this presentation are the opening of the Jebel Ali port and the Dubai World Trade Center, both in 1979, which ensured growth along this very narrow strip, this corridor of Sheikh Zayed Road. But all of these projects, these and the other ones, were to increase foreign investment into Dubai. And then in this slide I show that this is pretty important, because when the World Trade Center was built in '79, it's up here, which if you notice, this is the original core of the city. So even back then when this was made, it was out in the hinterlands of what was Dubai at the time. And then way down here you have the Jebel Ali port, and then this is Sheikh Zayed Road, which it ensured that the city grew linearly along this pattern, and that's where you see pretty much all the development that people now associate with Dubai. So then I move on a little bit to talk about some of the neoliberal policies and how it's impacted the city. Neoliberal policies since the inception of the UAE: no sales or income tax, and this absence of taxes leads the government to run the city like a business in order to generate revenue for its operating budget, which comes from income earned by government-related enterprises, which they're pretty big ones, like Emirates Airline, Akil is a property developer in Dubai World, which is a large holding company. And this is where the term Dubai Inc. comes from, if any of you have heard of that term. And they're largely responsible for much of the development of Dubai, especially in real estate. So if you look at Emaar, Nikhil, and Dubai Properties for the main property developers, the Burj Khalifa, the Dubai Mall, Mall of the Emirates, Dubai Marina, Palm Islands, those are all big constructions done by these firms, which it goes to show the relationship between these government-related enterprises and the current landscape of Dubai. And and the construction of a particular kind of neoliberal space that's catered to consumerism and wealthy expatriates and economic flows. So moving on to a little bit more about that. Their goal has been to attract foreign investment since the 20th century, which is kind of what I mentioned a couple slides ago. And it does create a space that caters to economic flows, and the primary use of space in Dubai is at least supposed to be economic space, which I'll get into a little bit more about how that's not always the case. But the diversification of the economy into real estate, tourism, and financial services also impacted this in the neoliberalization of the city. And between the infrastructure projects in the 60s and the diversification of the 90s and 2000s, a large foreign population has been imported into the city. And it really forms the backbone of the Dubai economy, more so than just kind of the, things that people say about how the city was literally built on the backs of migrants that are, a lot of times shown as slave labor, essentially. But it's just throughout the economy, from management to service to construction, it all is based upon migrant labor. So then I'll move on to the role of the state and elite constructions of identity and how the state's responsible for these kind of constructions. So initially, in the early 20th century, the government allied with merchants to keep political control, but some of these merchants resisted Maktoum control, which is the dynasty in Dubai, control of state income, and they were also anti-British influence, which the Maktoum had a very close relationship with the British. But this changed with the discovery of oil, because instead of just having to appease the merchants who had more influence and money, the government could just use oil revenue essentially to co-opt the citizenry and give up, so that they would give up their political rights. But in order for this to be effective, it required an inflexible boundary of who belonged to the state and who did not. So to do this, they constructed a form of national identity in order to designate who could claim these, the welfare goods, the generous welfare goods that the state provides, something around the order of over $20,000 per citizen per year. And then this has led to the initiation of projects to preserve and protect this certain form of national identity, largely centered around Arab and Islamic constructs, such as the national dress, which is largely a post-oil construction and just serves as a badge of privilege to denote Emiratis and other Gulf Arabs from other Arabs and from South Asians and Western expatriates. And the city is largely responsible for telling the national narrative. Also Arabic, which has been declining in use to the point of almost a second language because of the increase in English, because of the policies the government has initiated that support globalization, which has decreased the use of Arabic and increased the use of English. And a Bedouin background, which is also interesting because a lot of the native population of the area was from the settled coast, which they actually were at odds often with the Bedouin of the interior. So that's kind of a strange construct that they use as well. And then the national narrative often excludes key communities and glosses over disputed histories, largely foreign communities that have been entrenched in the city for over 100 years, kind of glossed over, and disputed histories such as any resistance to the ruling family. And then with the changing demographics of the city as migration increased, the debate on national identity intensified. And the low-income migrant population inhibits the government's attempts to attract tourism and investment, and thus they're actively kept from utilizing the spaces of New Dubai, which are heavily marketed for these purposes and categorized by spectacular development, which I'll go into a little bit more later. Basically, these are what factors into brand Dubai, which is what the government and the government-related firms market abroad as what the essence of the city is, to the exclusion of these other groups. So the migrant geographies are very important in looking at Dubai, and I'll talk a little bit about government policies that impact migrants and foreign workers. They're required to have a sponsor in order to live and work in Dubai. And then they operate on 3-year renewable labor contracts that can be canceled at any time, and bans on returning are often imposed. Sometimes they're 6-month bans, sometimes they're permanent. They vary, but they do exist. And what this does is it polices the behavior of migrant workers. So it causes them to kind of live in a state of fear of being, deported from Dubai, so that they behave in a certain way. And then economic migration rationales are often employed by Emiratis as well as others, and they say why migrants come to the city. And because, under this viewpoint, because they came here for economic opportunities alone, they don't have any kind of claim to belonging in Dubai, belonging to the society or culture, and definitely don't have any belonging to protection from the state. And what this does is it instills a feeling of transience and non-belonging, as they can't become citizens and they don't have any claim to the memories, histories, or a lot of the spaces of Dubai, despite the presence of entrenched communities of, like I said, largely South Asians that have been here for quite a long time. Migrants also experience limited physical mobility. Geographic distancing and biased infrastructure development impacts this greatly. So in terms of geographic distancing, the areas where migrants live are located far away from the areas marketed as Dubai, like Dubai Mall, Burj Khalifa, Dubai Marina, etc. And they live in old Dubai around the creek. And these areas are surrounded by highways and require cars to access. So low-income migrants simply can't afford cars to be able to travel to these places anyway, and I'm going to speed up. So, this just shows kind of how these are just, the streets are unwalkable in New Dubai, like you can't get around anywhere by walking. But despite their feelings of transience and non-belonging, they actively construct their identities and produce them in a city that excludes them, and this is largely around the Dubai Creek, where there are South Asian restaurants, shops, and cultural activities that they can use to reaffirm their identity in these spaces. And in the absence of any real public space, street corners, shopping centers, and small lawns become the gathering spaces. And this just shows some of the shops catering to South Asians and some congregating on the street corner. And then this is the Gubaiba metro station, which has become a major gathering point for migrants. I noticed that when I was there and I took this picture, just showing that this is their public space. And then that's another picture of that. And then moving on very briefly to elite geographies, the areas between the Dubai World Trade Center and Jebel Ali form what is known as New Dubai, which are characterized by spectacular real estate, meaning, themed, gimmicky, or superlative things such as the Palm Islands, the indoor ski slope at the Mall of the Emirates, the tallest building, the largest mall, those kind of things. And it's really a disconnected enclaves. So a build-up area, large unfinished space, and another build-up area, which leaves a transitory atmosphere. And these projects are undertaken by large government-related developers, and they include traditional architecture, which is an interesting way that the government and these developers kind of reinforce the identity of the citizens or the identity of the city as some Arabic city, because these are largely Arabian themes. And then it's commodified so that when people go there and they consume this space, it's again reaffirming these government constructions of identity. And then this is just an example of kind of that transitory space where there's a large build-up area. This is, I believe, around the Dubai Mall, but a little bit to the west of there. Yeah. So that just shows that large empty spaces between build-up areas. Same thing with this picture. There's a build-up utilizing this space. This is in the New Dubai area as well, where there are these sidewalks, but it requires cars to get to them anyway, and once you get there, no one's really out walking around. So these areas were created, developed, and marketed by the state to serve a very specific group, which are largely Emirati nationals, wealthy expatriates, and tourists. And the use of these spaces falls in line with the state intent, which is consumption and enterprise, and again, the concept of neoliberal space. And these areas wouldn't be attractive to these elite groups if lower income migrants could utilize them easily. So this is a picture from the Dubai Mall showing these two, either Gulf Arab or Emirati men walking around wearing the national dress. And this picture, but the next one mostly shows kind of the clientele of these areas is largely Western expatriates and tourists. And then there's also this interesting phenomenon of self-segregation that occurs in Dubai, where both Emiratis and South Asian migrants practice self-segregation, both in where they live and where they go. So you'll have Emiratis avoiding going into places that they feel are foreign, such as Old Dubai especially, but even New Dubai because of the presence of Western expatriates. So then there's been a mass exodus to the suburbs, a lot of suburbanization among the Emirati population, where they feel that they can exhibit their Emirati and Islamic identities without negative, largely foreign influences. And South Asian migrants, likewise, don't venture into New Dubai because it's not viewed to them as a South Asian space. And then in terms of Emiratis viewing New Dubai as foreign spaces, they don't feel welcome in some of the places, and it's gotten to the point where even some hotels only allow Western dress. And one author noted that they've essentially become passive observers to what their city has become. and thus very few people are ever invited into the social world of the Emiratis. So in conclusion, the transience of migrant workers as a result of the state's policies on immigration instills a feeling of non-belonging. The state's policies restricting their movement and prohibiting them from utilizing the spaces of New Dubai relegates them to Old Dubai. And in these spaces, their association with people from the same ethnic background allows them to produce and reinforce their identities. And the government largely accepts this because these places aren't part of brand Dubai. They don't factor into what is marketed as Dubai, and they don't factor into what many people think of as Dubai. And then for Emiratis, the government attempts to promote a national identity, and that greatly impacts theirs. They lament the loss of their culture and heritage in the face of migration, based a lot of times upon these government discourses. And foreigners are posited as a negative influence on the culture of Emiratis. Thus, they cling to a romanticized version of the past, which they use to kind of navigate the situation of the present. Because there has been extreme change in the city with development and modernization. And then by utilizing the spaces in New Dubai and self-segregating the suburbs, they reinforce these notions of state-sanctioned identity. And then I have to stop.
No, you can wrap. You have
okay, I can wrap up. Okay, this is my last thing. So just kind of looking forward in terms of ways to go with this topic and kind of things to expand on. One of the first things is as globalization increases and integration into the economy increases, and as even more foreign workers pouring in the city, what will the impacts be? Will it bring about a reconciliation between these groups and an actual embrace of the cosmopolitan nature that does exist in Dubai? Or will it continue to provoke reactionary policies by the government and reactionary actions by the various groups, increasing segregation and isolation? And then the increasing population of Emiratis, there are government encouragements of intermarriage between, Emiratis marrying Emiratis, which has actually increased the population. I think something around the area of 4% per year, which is pretty large considering how small their population is anyway. So the question is, will this cause more problems as the government has to provide welfare goods to an increasing citizenry that may eventually make demands for political rights or otherwise weakening government power? And then the third is, will the Dubai Metro lead to a more integrated urban fabric? Because it is a form of infrastructure that is theoretically accessible to everyone equally, and there are stations throughout New Dubai and Old Dubai, and it's not very expensive to use. But when I was there, and that wasn't very long, but I noticed that it was largely the same clientele that utilized the spaces of New Dubai that were also utilizing the metro, which are largely expatriates, wealthy expatriates, and tourists.
So we have time for about one question here.
Okay.
While we're before we move on to our next.
Yes.
Well, I came in late. I don't know. As I heard migration, it appears that there's over concentration of facilities, development facilities at Dubai, causing the hinterland and the periphery to be moving. Does it have any religious implications? And two, what planning strategy must be put in place to break the concentration?
Okay, so religious impacts in terms of, does the development impact religious identities?
Does religion have a role to play?
It does. In promoting these state constructions of identity, Islam especially definitely has a role to play, especially through what religious leaders are allowed to say during their sermons, both in terms of like there are Christian and Jewish places of worship in Dubai, but also in the mosques. They're definitely limited on what they can say as to promote the kind of Islam or the kind of Christianity or whatnot that the state doesn't find threatening to their power. So that does have a role to play. And in terms of the everyday lives of Emiratis, they are largely, they are Islamic. They do go to mosque and those kind of things. So that does have a role to play. And in terms of strategies to kind of break down these segregationist things, these kind of these constructions of identity, I think that things like the Dubai Metro that do have the potential to integrate both areas of Dubai work as well. And there's also the Palm Dara, which is a large, another one of the Palm Islands that they are planning to build. It's on hold now, but that comes right out of the area of Dera and Old Dubai, and that may bring increased investment to that area. But what I think may happen with that is that it will just end up forcing out the lower income people to even farther out of the city. So in the absence of any kind of radical change in terms of what the government's doing in terms of development or in terms of promoting the kind of both areas being mixed together, I doubt that anything's going to change in the near future, just because of the morphology of the city isn't conducive to having these two areas integrated. But hopefully that answered some more.
Thank you.